On June 14, 1944, at 6:42, a single Allied fighter aircraft descended through broken cloud over a mixed agricultural district in northwestern Europe. The aircraft had sustained engine damage at altitude after ground fire during a low-level reconnaissance run. Oil pressure had dropped below operating limits within 3 minutes. At 6:49, the pilot reduced throttle to preserve rotational speed and turned the aircraft on a shallow glide toward a patchwork of hedgerows and small fields aligned on a northwest-southeast axis. Ground elevation in the area ranged between 78 and 96 meters above sea level, with no continuous tree cover and limited concealment from the air. At 6:55, the aircraft struck the ground at an estimated forward speed of 145 kilometers per hour, nose low, landing gear retracted. The impact occurred 110 meters from a narrow dirt lane used primarily for foot traffic and carts. The aircraft broke apart on contact, scattering fragments over a radius of 40 meters. A brief fuel fire ignited but self-extinguished within 2 minutes due to the limited remaining fuel load. The pilot exited the cockpit at 6:57, sustaining abrasions to both forearms and a suspected hairline fracture to the left wrist. No other injuries were immediately apparent. The pilot carried standard survival equipment, a compact medical packet, a folded silk escape map printed with regional rail lines and waterways, a small quantity of local currency, and a sidearm. The sidearm was a Browning high-power, semi-automatic, single-action pistol, chambered in 9 by 19 millimeters, with a 13-round magazine. The unloaded weight was 1.02 kilograms. The pistol was carried without a shoulder holster, secured instead in a belt-mounted leather pouch. No long gun was present, compared to standard infantry rifles in the area. The pistol offered limited range, minimal stopping power beyond 25 meters, and no capability for sustained engagement. Its presence was defensive only. By 7:03, the pilot had moved 90 meters east from the wreckage, using hedgerows approximately 1.4 meters high for cover. Smoke from the impact site was visible intermittently from the road. Wind was light, measured later at 3 to 4 meters per second from the west, dispersing smoke unevenly and delaying visual detection from distance. Weather conditions were stable. Overcast at 1,800 meters, visibility 7 to 9 kilometers, temperature 14 degrees Celsius. Civilian movement began along the dirt lane at 7:10. 2 individuals on foot approaching the south paused at a distance of approximately 60 meters from the wreckage and then altered course. No immediate alarm was raised. The pilot remained prone, observing through gaps in vegetation, noting clothing styles and gait to assess local population rather than military patrols. No weapons were visible on the civilians. At 7:18, the pilot assessed the immediate tactical situation. Remaining near the crash site increased the likelihood of rapid encirclement once enemy response units were dispatched. However, immediate flight into open countryside risked exposure. The area contained multiple stone farmhouses spaced 300 to 600 meters apart, with field divided by low hedges and drainage ditches averaging 0.6 meters in depth. There was no forest cover within 1.2 kilometers. The pilot removed insignia from his flight jacket at 7:21, tearing stitching with a pocket knife. He concealed the jacket beneath foliage and retained a neutral-colored shirt beneath. The pistol was kept but concealed. The silk map was reviewed briefly, then folded and placed inside the shirt to prevent loss. Orientation was set using sun position and map alignment. The pilot selected a route toward a small village identified 2.4 kilometers east-southeast. Estimated walking time 45 to 55 minutes if unopposed. Movement began at 7:26. The pilot advanced in short intervals, rarely exceeding 40 meters between pauses. At each halt, he remained stationary for 2 to 3 minutes, scanning for movement, listening for engine noise or shouted commands. At 7:41, distant engine sounds were detected from the northwest, estimated 1.5 to 2 kilometers away, consistent with light trucks or motorcycles. The pilot halted for 9 minutes, remaining crouched in a drainage ditch partially filled with water. By 7:52, civilian activity increased. A woman carrying agricultural tools passed within 18 meters of the pilot's position, showing no sign of alarm. The pilot adjusted posture to mirror civilian laborers when moving, maintaining an upright but unhurried pace when crossing open ground. This adaptation reduced contrast with local movement patterns. At 8:07, the pilot entered the outer edge of the village. Structures were primarily stone 1 to 2 stories, with narrow lanes measuring 2 to 3 meters in width. No military vehicles were present at that time. The pilot slowed movement further, stopping at every intersection for observation periods averaging 90 seconds. Fatigue was already evident. Heart rate remained elevated from injury and exertion, causing shallow breathing that required conscious control to reduce noise. At 8:19, the first enemy patrol entered the village from the northwest. The patrol consisted of 4 soldiers, standard field uniforms, carrying bolt-action rifles with fixed bayonets. Their movement was methodical, spacing 8 to 10 meters apart, scanning doorways and yards. The pilot was concealed inside a narrow passage between 2 buildings with 0.9 meters, depth 12 meters, with no exit at the far end. The pilot remained stationary from 8:19 to 9:03. During this period, he did not adjust position except to shift weight to reduce numbness in the legs. The patrol passed twice within audible range. No direct line of sight occurred. Civilian activity diminished noticeably, indicating informal warning or intimidation by occupying forces. At 9:11, the pilot identified a potential refuge, a small outbuilding attached to a larger farmhouse, used for tool storage. Entry was gained without force. Inside, the pilot stood for several minutes to allow circulation to return to legs, then sat on the floor. The interior temperature was cooler, estimated 11 to 12 degrees Celsius, slowing sweat evaporation and reducing scent. By 9:34, distant whistle signals were heard, followed by raised voices. The enemy's search effort was expanding outward from the crash site toward the village. The pilot remained motionless. There was no attempt to flee further. The decision at this stage was to remain in place, blend into the civilian environment, and allow the initial surge of search activity to pass. At 10:02, footsteps approached the outbuilding. They paused outside for 14 seconds, then moved on. No door was opened. The pilot did not reach for the pistol. He focused on breathing control and posture, maintaining a civilian profile if discovered. By 10:30, the immediate area settled into intermittent patrol patterns rather than continuous movement. The pilot remained concealed, aware that the next phase would involve prolonged hiding under increasing scrutiny rather than rapid escape. At 10:31 on June 14, 1944, the immediate auditory environment around the outbuilding shifted from continuous movement to intermittent, irregular sounds. Footsteps now occurred in pairs or single passes rather than patrol formations. Engine noise was present every 12 to 18 minutes, indicating a rotating search perimeter rather than a linear sweep. The pilot remained seated on the dirt floor, back against a stone wall, knees drawn slightly upward to reduce profile. He did not sleep. Fatigue manifested as muscular tremor in the thighs and forearms, controlled through deliberate posture adjustment rather than movement. The structure measured 3.2 meters by 2.1 meters, with a single outward opening wooden door facing north. No windows were present. Light entered only through gaps between roof tiles, creating narrow beams that shifted subtly as cloud cover moved. The pilot positioned himself outside these beams to avoid silhouette formation. Dust in the air settled gradually, reducing particulate movement that could otherwise reveal motion. At 10:47, a pair of enemy soldiers entered the farmyard. Their boots struck stone surfaces rather than soil, indicating proximity within 15 to 20 meters. One voice spoke briefly, volume controlled, suggesting checklist-style inspection rather than alarm. A metal object was moved, likely a bucket or tool, then replaced. No attempt was made to open the outbuilding door. The soldiers departed at 10:52. The pilot assessed that the search doctrine had shifted. Initial rapid pursuit was giving way to area denial and containment. This was consistent with enemy counter-evasion procedures. Prevent movement, pressure civilians, and rely on time rather than speed. The pilot's lack of long-range weaponry or radio contact meant no external coordination was possible. Survival depended entirely on concealment and behavioral conformity. Between 11 o'clock and 12:30, civilian presence in the farmyard increased. 2 individuals entered and exited the main farmhouse, carrying containers and agricultural implements. Their movement appeared deliberate but unhurried. No gestures or signals were directed toward the outbuilding. The pilot did not attempt contact. Any interaction risked compromise under later interrogation. At 12:41, a light rain began. Precipitation was steady but minimal, measured later at 1.2 millimeters per hour. The sound masked subtle movements, but also increased ambient humidity. The pilot adjusted clothing layers to prevent shivering, which could create audible vibration against the stone wall. The left wrist pain intensified due to swelling, but no splinting was possible without visible materials. At 13:05, a marked change occurred. A larger enemy element entered the village. Engine noise was continuous for 6 minutes, followed by multiple door impacts and raised voices. The sound profile suggested at least 2 light trucks and 1 motorcycle, with an estimated manpower increase of 15 to 20 soldiers. Search intensity escalated from perimeter control to systematic building inspection. From 13:12 to 14:08, the pilot remained completely immobile. During this interval, 3 separate inspection teams passed within 5 meters of the outbuilding. On the second pass, at 13:37, the door handle was tested lightly. It did not open. The lock held. The pilot's hand rested on the pistol grip, but did not apply pressure. Engagement at this distance would have been immediately decisive but strategically catastrophic, triggering overwhelming response and civilian reprisals. The handle was released after 4 seconds. Footsteps withdrew. The pilot did not exhale audibly until 18 seconds after the sound ceased. Heart rate gradually returned to a controllable level. At 14:22, the rain ceased. Light levels increased marginally. The pilot shifted position by approximately 15 centimeters, redistributing weight to avoid numbness. This was the first voluntary movement in nearly 4 hours. Muscular stiffness was pronounced. Circulation returned slowly, accompanied by involuntary twitching, which he suppressed by bracing limbs against the floor and wall. Enemy activity peaked between 1430 and 1600 hours. During this period, searches extended outward again, suggesting no immediate capture near the crash site. The pilot inferred that descriptions of the downed airmen were being circulated among patrols. This increased risk of visual identification, even without uniforms. At 16:18, the farmhouse occupants departed the property on foot, carrying personal items. This indicated either forced relocation or voluntary evacuation under pressure. The outbuilding was left unattended. This reduced immediate risk of accidental discovery, but removed a layer of civilian normalization. Between 1630 and 1800 hours, the area quieted. Only distant vehicle noise remained. The pilot did not attempt movement. The doctrine at this stage favored patience. Nightfall would change both risk and opportunity. At 1847, a final patrol passed the farmyard. Their pace was slower, fatigue evident in footfall cadence. No inspection was made of the outbuilding. By 1905, the environment transitioned to low-activity status. Light levels dropped steadily after 2010. The pilot remained inside the structure through dusk. At 21:02, full darkness set in. Cloud cover prevented moon illumination. Visibility dropped below 20 meters unaided. At 21:14, the pilot initiated the next phase. He exited the outbuilding silently, closing the door without engaging the latch to avoid noise. Movement was directed south-southeast, away from the village center. Pace was reduced to 0.8 to 1.0 kilometers per hour, with pauses every 30 to 40 meters. Between 21:14 and 23:40, the pilot covered approximately 1.1 kilometers, remaining parallel to hedgerows and drainage lines. He avoided open ground exceeding 25 meters in width. No enemy contact occurred, but distant voices and engine noise indicated active patrols on main roads. At 23:58, the pilot reached a shallow depression adjacent to a fallow field. Depth was 0.7 meters, width 4 meters. He lay prone, using vegetation for concealment. Body temperature dropped noticeably. Sleep occurred in fragmented intervals of 3 to 7 minutes, interrupted by involuntary muscle contractions and environmental noise. At 2:16 on June 15, 1944, a flare illuminated the northern horizon, lasting 11 seconds. The pilot remained motionless. No follow-up activity approached his position. By 4:03, pre-dawn light began to return. The pilot assessed his position and physical condition. Mobility remained intact despite stiffness. The pistol remained loaded, chamber empty, safety engaged. As daylight approached, the enemy's search entered its second day. The pilot was now outside the immediate crash perimeter, but still within an active containment zone. The next period would test endurance rather than speed. At 4:12 on June 15, 1944, ambient light increased to a level sufficient for unaided navigation without artificial illumination. The pilot remained prone in the shallow depression, facing east. Wind was minimal, estimated 1 to 2 meters per second, carrying sound poorly and limiting auditory warning. The temperature had dropped to 9 degrees Celsius, producing stiffness in the hands and forearms. The pilot flexed fingers slowly, once every 90 seconds, to maintain dexterity without visible motion. At 4:36, distant engine noise resumed along the main road approximately 1.8 kilometers north. The sound pattern indicated a single vehicle moving at low speed, stopping intermittently. This was consistent with dawn patrol behavior. The pilot did not move. Early daylight increased the risk of detection during movement, while patrols were most alert. Between 5 o'clock and 6:10, the pilot remained in place. During this interval, civilian activity began again at scattered points across the countryside. Individual figures could be seen at distances exceeding 300 meters, moving along hedgerows and between fields. No organized formations were observed. The pilot studied these movements carefully, noting pace, posture, and spacing, using them as a behavioral baseline. At 6:18, an enemy patrol emerged from the east at a distance of approximately 220 meters. The patrol consisted of 3 soldiers, moving in a staggered line abreast, spacing 6 to 8 meters. Each carried a bolt-action rifle, likely chambered in 7.92 by 57 millimeters. Standard infantry configuration with iron sights. Rifles of this type weighed approximately 4.1 kilograms unloaded, significantly heavier and longer than the pilot's sidearm. Effective engagement range exceeded 400 meters, giving the patrol dominance in open terrain. The patrol halted at 6:23, scanning the field edges. One soldier knelt, using binoculars. The pilot remained prone, face turned slightly downward to reduce reflective surfaces. Clothing coloration matched soil tones sufficiently to break outline at that distance. The patrol resumed movement at 6:31, altering course to the north. No engagement occurred. At 6:54, the pilot initiated movement. Direction was set southward, toward a low-lying area intersected by irrigation channels. The pilot advanced 120 meters over 18 minutes, using a crawl posture when crossing open patches exceeding 10 meters. Fatigue accumulated rapidly. Breathing was controlled to avoid audible exhalation. At 7:19, a sudden change occurred. A civilian emerged from behind a hedgerow at approximately 14 meters. The individual stopped abruptly. Visual contact lasted 2 to 3 seconds. No verbal exchange occurred. The civilian then turned away and continued walking without signaling. The pilot remained still for 7 minutes afterward, assessing whether the encounter had been observed by others. No immediate response followed. By 7:42, enemy presence increased again. 2 patrols operated in overlapping arcs, one to the west, one to the southeast. Their movement patterns suggested tightening containment rather than random search. The pilot adjusted route accordingly, angling toward a cluster of low stone walls marking an abandoned agricultural enclosure. At 8:05, the pilot reached the enclosure. Walls averaged 0.8 meters in height, with partial collapse in sections. Vegetation growth provided limited concealment. The pilot entered the enclosure and remained crouched for 42 minutes, scanning through gaps. During this time, a patrol passed within 35 meters, moving perpendicular to the pilot's line of sight. No detection occurred. At 8:52, the pilot made a critical decision. Remaining static increased the probability of eventual discovery as search density increased. Movement, though risky, offered the possibility of blending again into civilian patterns. The pilot stood, adjusted posture to an upright stance, and adopted a walking pace consistent with agricultural laborers observed earlier, approximately 3 kilometers per hour. Between 8:52 and 9:27, the pilot moved along a hedgerow-lined path, carrying no visible equipment. The pistol remained concealed beneath clothing. At 9:14, an enemy soldier appeared ahead at approximately 60 meters, facing away. The pilot reduced pace slightly, then stopped, bending at the waist as if inspecting the ground. The soldier did not turn. At 9:33, the first direct hostile interaction occurred. An enemy motorcycle approached from behind, engine speed low. The rider slowed as he drew parallel at approximately 8 meters, visually inspecting the pilot. The pilot maintained neutral posture, head down, hands visible. The motorcycle paused for 5 seconds, then accelerated away. No challenge was issued. The pilot did not look up until engine noise faded beyond 200 meters. At 10:06, enemy search tactics shifted again. Whistle signals were heard at regular intervals, every 90 to 120 seconds, indicating coordinated movement across a wider front. This increased the risk of being caught between elements. The pilot diverted toward a shallow stream, 1.2 meters wide, water depth 20 to 30 centimeters. From 10:18 to 10:41, the pilot remained in the stream bed, moving slowly upstream to disrupt scent and footprint tracking. Boots were submerged continuously, reducing traction and increasing fatigue. The water temperature was low, estimated 8 degrees Celsius, accelerating numbness in the feet. At 10:44, voices were heard nearby. An enemy element halted on the bank approximately 25 meters away. One soldier entered the stream briefly, probing the water with a stick. The pilot remained pressed against the bank, body aligned with the stream flow, minimizing profile. The soldier withdrew after 40 seconds. The patrol moved on. By 11:12, the pilot exited the stream and concealed himself beneath dense vegetation. He remained there until 13:30, during which time multiple patrols passed at varying distances. The pilot did not move, conserving energy and allowing circulation to return to the extremities. At 13:47, hunger and dehydration became significant. The pilot consumed a small portion of emergency ration, chewing slowly to avoid noise. Water was taken from the stream earlier untreated, increasing later risk but necessary for immediate function. At 14:20, the search intensity began to taper slightly. Patrol intervals lengthened. This suggested diminishing confidence in immediate capture. However, checkpoints remained active on major routes. At 15:03, the pilot moved again, covering approximately 600 meters by 1610. No further direct encounters occurred during this period, but distant gunfire was heard twice, origin unknown, indicating unrelated security actions. As evening approached, the pilot selected a concealed position beneath a collapsed hedge bank. He remained there through dusk. The day had involved multiple near detections, but no exchange of fire. Each avoided contact, reinforced the necessity of restraint over aggression. The search had not yet failed. It had simply entered a slower, more methodical phase. At 18:02 on June 15, 1944, ambient light dropped below optimal visual thresholds for long-range observation. Cloud cover thickened, producing uniform gray conditions with no sharp shadows. The pilot remained beneath the collapsed hedge bank, body aligned parallel to the slope to reduce outline. Soil moisture increased as humidity rose, dampening sound transmission, but also increasing discomfort. The pilot did not change position. Between 1830 and 1910, enemy activity intensified along the main road network. Engine noise increased in frequency, with vehicles stopping at regular intervals. This indicated the establishment of evening checkpoints. The pilot inferred that daylight failure had shifted enemy doctrine toward route control and denial of movement rather than area sweeps. At 1922, a patrol passed within 45 meters of the hedge bank. Their movement was slower than earlier in the day. Fatigue was evident in uneven pacing and reduced spacing discipline. One soldier paused briefly, scanning laterally with a flashlight, though light use was restrained to avoid revealing positions. The beam did not reach the pilot's location. By 20:05, full darkness set in. Visibility dropped below 15 meters, unaided. The pilot waited an additional 27 minutes to allow patrol patterns to stabilize. Movement immediately after nightfall often attracted attention due to expectation of escape attempts. At 20:33, the pilot initiated movement. Direction was adjusted southwest, toward a sparsely populated zone identified earlier on the escape map. Pace was reduced to 0.6 to 0.8 kilometers per hour, with frequent halts. The pilot used tactile navigation, maintaining contact with hedgerows and stone boundaries to avoid silhouette exposure against open ground. At 21:11, a dog was heard barking intermittently to the north. The sound pattern suggested a domestic animal rather than train tracking. However, the pilot adjusted route to increase distance, diverting 110 meters southward. This added time but reduced risk of unpredictable behavior. Between 21:30 and 22:40, the pilot covered approximately 700 meters. Movement was interrupted twice by distant whistle signals and once by shouted commands, none directed at his immediate vicinity. The pilot froze during each instance, resuming movement only after 3 to 5 minutes of silence. At 22:58, the pilot encountered an unexpected obstacle, a temporary roadblock consisting of a wooden barrier and a shallow trench across a minor farm track. The position was unmanned at that moment but showed signs of recent occupation. Footprints, cigarette remnants, and disturbed soil. The pilot waited 18 minutes, observing from cover. No personnel returned during that period. At 23:19, the pilot bypassed a roadblock by crawling through a drainage culvert 0.9 meters in diameter. The interior was muddy and partially flooded. Passage took 6 minutes. Clothing and boots became saturated, increasing weight and reducing thermal insulation. At 23:47, the pilot reached a small orchard. Trees were spaced 4 to 5 meters apart, offering broken concealment. He remained there until 1:20 on June 16th, using the time to rest in a seated position, back against the trunk. Sleep occurred in brief intervals of 5 to 10 minutes, interrupted by muscle cramps and environmental noise. At 1:42, engine noise approached from the east. A vehicle stopped briefly on a nearby track, approximately 120 meters away. Voices were heard for under 2 minutes. Then the vehicle departed. No search element entered the orchard. At 2:30, light rain resumed. Precipitation increased steadily, reaching 2.0 millimeters per hour by 3 o'clock. This further degraded visibility and sound detection, but increased the risk of hypothermia. The pilot adjusted posture frequently to maintain circulation, despite discomfort. By 4:18, pre-dawn light returned. The pilot assessed physical condition. Hands were numb but functional. Left wrist pain remained constant but manageable. No signs of infection were evident. The pistol remained unfired and concealed. At 4:35, the pilot resumed movement. Direction was now west-southwest, toward a cluster of farm buildings previously observed to be unoccupied. Movement during early dawn carried risk, but also reduced contrast against the environment as civilian activity resumed. At 5:12, the pilot observed enemy troops establishing a temporary command post near a crossroads approximately 600 meters north. Antenna masts were visible, indicating radio coordination. This suggested the search operation was being reassessed rather than abandoned. At 5:40, the pilot reached the target farmstead. Buildings were in disrepair, with collapsed roofing on one structure. No vehicles were present. Entry was gained through a broken door. Inside, the pilot selected a rear room with no direct line of sight from outside. He remained there from 5:47 to 9:10, resting, drying clothing partially, and monitoring activity through small gaps in the wall. During this interval, 2 patrols passed the property without inspection. Enemy movement appeared focused elsewhere, likely responding to intelligence gaps rather than specific sightings. By mid-morning, the search had transitioned again. It was no longer reactive but routine, relying on time and civilian pressure. The pilot's continued survival depended on avoiding both patterns and assumptions. The next period would determine whether the containment could be broken or whether prolonged concealment among civilians would be required. At 9:14 on June 16, 1944, ambient activity around the abandoned farmstead increased slightly. Distant civilian movement resumed along secondary paths. The pilot remained inside the rear room, positioned on the floor against an interior wall. He did not look out continuously. Observation was conducted in 30 to 40-second intervals, separated by rest periods to reduce eye strain and mental fatigue. The structure's interior temperature had risen to 15 degrees Celsius, sufficient to prevent further loss of body heat, but not enough to dry clothing fully. At 9:47, enemy vehicle noise approached from the south. The sound pattern indicated a light truck moving at moderate speed, then decelerating. The vehicle stopped approximately 180 meters away. Doors opened. Voices followed, measured and procedural. The pilot inferred another search element repositioning rather than a chance encounter. From 10:02 to 11:18, enemy troops conducted a partial sweep of nearby properties. One patrol passed the farmstead perimeter at 10:31, maintaining a distance of 25 to 30 meters. They did not approach the buildings directly. Their attention appeared directed toward fields and hedgerows rather than structures. This indicated a working assumption that the pilot had either already passed through or was no longer mobile. At 11:40, a critical development occurred. Two civilians entered the farmstead yard. They carried tools and moved with familiarity, indicating local ownership or responsibility. Their presence introduced both opportunity and risk. Civilian normalization could mask the pilot's presence, but discovery would likely lead to coercive disclosure. The pilot remained hidden until 12:26. During this time, the civilians worked intermittently, entering and exiting the main building. No approach was made to the rear structure. At 12:27, one civilian moved toward the rear room door. Distance closed to less than 4 meters. The pilot adjusted posture to remain fully behind the interior wall, pistol held but not raised. The civilian paused, then turned away. No entry occurred. The pilot did not move for an additional 22 minutes, allowing adrenaline response to subside. At 12:55, the civilians departed. The yard returned to inactivity. The pilot reassessed the situation. Remaining in the farmstead risked eventual inspection once search patterns recycled. Movement, though hazardous, offered a possibility of escaping containment zone entirely. At 13:12, the pilot initiated movement again. Direction was adjusted northwest, aiming to intersect the drainage canal shown on the silk map that led toward less controlled terrain. Pace was steady at 1.5 kilometers per hour, faster than previous night movement, but still conservative. Between 13:12 and 14:08, the pilot covered approximately 1.4 kilometers. Terrain consisted of gently sloping fields with intermittent hedgerows. Visibility ranged 400 to 600 meters. No enemy patrols were encountered directly, but two vehicles were observed at long range, remaining on established roads. At 14:19, the pilot reached the drainage canal, with measured 2.3 meters, depth 0.8 meters. Water flow was slow, but continuous. Vegetation along the banks provided concealment. The pilot entered the canal at 14:24, submerging boots and lower legs. He proceeded downstream for 320 meters, using the canal as both cover and movement corridor. At 14:58, the pilot exited the canal beneath a culvert passing under a farm road. He remained there for 17 minutes, listening for traffic. One vehicle passed overhead at 15:06. No foot traffic followed. At 15:22, the pilot resumed movement, now beyond the densest patrol zones identified earlier. Enemy presence remained possible but less concentrated. Fatigue was pronounced. The pilot's gait showed reduced efficiency, compensated by shorter strides and frequent pauses. At 16:10, distant artillery fire was heard to the west. The sound was low and irregular, suggesting activity along a separate front line. This had a secondary effect. Enemy patrol attention appeared divided, with some resources redirected. Between 1630 and 1800 hours, the pilot moved continuously, covering approximately 2.1 kilometers. No enemy contact occurred. Civilian movement was sparse. The landscape transitioned to less cultivated ground, with wider hedgerows and patches of unmanaged vegetation. At 1807, the pilot halted at the edge of a small wooded area. Tree height 6 to 8 meters, undergrowth moderate. This was the first true concealment, with overhead cover encountered since the aircraft loss. The pilot entered the woodline at 1814 and remained there. As darkness approached, the pilot's condition stabilized. Immediate pursuit pressure had diminished. The search had not ended, but its intensity was no longer focused on his immediate vicinity. The decisive period was not marked by combat or capture, but by the gradual erosion of enemy certainty. Survival had been achieved through time, restraint, and adaptation rather than force. At 1822, on June 16, 1944, the pilot settled deeper into the wooded area. The canopy reduced light penetration, creating early dusk conditions even before sunset. Ground cover consisted of leaf litter and damp soil, reducing noise but increasing moisture exposure. The pilot selected a position 14 meters from the woodline, avoiding the edge where silhouette risk was highest. He sat with back against a tree trunk measuring 32 centimeters in diameter, knees drawn slightly upward, pistol still concealed but accessible. Between 1830 and 1945, the pilot remained stationary. Enemy activity in the broader area continued but was now distant. Engine noise was sporadic and oriented toward the main road network rather than secondary tracks. No foot patrols entered the wooded area during this period. The pilot used the time to assess injuries more thoroughly. The left wrist showed swelling but no visible deformity. Grip strength was reduced but functional. Abrasions on the forearms were cleaned with minimal water to prevent infection. At 1958, sunset occurred. Darkness followed rapidly under cloud cover. The pilot did not move immediately. He waited until 2031, allowing night patrols to establish routine patterns. This delay reduced the chance of intersecting newly deployed elements. At 2034, the pilot resumed movement, now with increased confidence but unchanged caution. Direction was set westward, following the wooded strip for approximately 900 meters. Movement speed averaged 1.2 kilometers per hour, slightly improved due to reduced psychological pressure. At 2118, the pilot encountered evidence of reduced enemy presence, abandoned observation positions, cold fire pits, and unguarded road markers. These indicators suggested that the intensive search phase had concluded or shifted elsewhere. The pilot did not assume safety. He continued to avoid open ground and maintain concealment discipline. Between 2140 and 2310, the pilot crossed two minor roads without incident. Traffic was minimal. One civilian cart passed at 2206, distant approximately 40 meters. With no interaction, the pilot remained concealed until it passed. At 2332, the pilot reached a shallow ravine leading toward terrain identified on the escape map as less controlled. He entered the ravine and followed it downstream, using its depth of 1.1 meters for concealment. Movement here was slower due to uneven footing, but detection risk was minimal. At 048 on June 17, 1944, the pilot halted for rest. Sleep occurred in brief intervals of 10 to 15 minutes, deeper than previous nights due to exhaustion. No enemy activity was detected nearby. Ambient temperature remained stable at 12 degrees Celsius. At 3:27, pre-dawn light began to return. The pilot resumed movement at 3:41, exiting the ravine and entering a lightly wooded agricultural margin. Civilian movement was minimal at this hour. The pilot adopted a low-profile walking posture, avoiding roads entirely. By 5:10, the pilot reached an area beyond the previously observed patrol density. No enemy vehicles or foot patrols were detected for over 90 minutes. This absence was significant. It indicated the effective boundary of the search operation. At 6:02, the pilot made contact with sympathetic civilians, initiating the next phase of evasion and eventual recovery. Details of this contact are beyond the scope of the immediate operation, but resulted in concealment, medical attention, and later extraction through established resistance networks. The enemy's search continued in reduced form for several additional days. Checkpoints remained, and civilians were questioned. However, without fresh indicators or sightings, the operation lost momentum. Resources were redirected to other priorities. For the pilot, survival was not the result of engagement or firepower. The sidearm remained unfired. No shots were exchanged. The outcome was determined by timing, restraint, terrain use, and the ability to remain indistinguishable within the civilian environment under sustained pressure. The event demonstrated the limits of even well-organized search operations when uncertainty erodes, and time favors concealment over pursuit.